In a World Report 2023, the Human Rights Watch says that 15 armed conflicts in Africa, in countries such as the DRC, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Mali, Burkina Faso, and South Sudan, government forces and militant groups have been implicated in abuses against civilians. Tigrayan forces in northern Ethiopia have started handing over their heavy weapons in line with the November peace deal. The agreement ends 2 years of brutal war with Ethiopian government forces. The SADC mission in Mozambique has instituted investigations regarding a video clip circulating on social media depicting members of defense forces throwing bodies of deceased people onto a pile of burning rubble. According to Human Rights Watch World Report 2023, African leaders have failed to tackle widespread abuses against civilians by state security forces and non-state armed groups, and insufficiently prioritized justice efforts for victims of atrocities across the continent. These violations occurred against a backdrop of backsliding on democratic safeguards and the rule of law.
In northern Ethiopia, the conflict in the Tigray, Amhara and Afar regions has had a devastating impact on the civilian populations. Significant parts of the Tigrayan population remain displaced and without access to desperately needed humanitarian assistance. In Congo, attacks against media freedom, the growing involvement of intelligence services in intimidating dissenters, and the general narrowing of democratic space have raised concerns ahead of the 2023 elections. In West Africa, notably Burkina Faso, Guinea and Mali, there have been no improvement in the conditions that precipitated recent coups. The African Union and ECOWAS responded by suspending membership and imposing or threatening sanctions. Increasing criticism of foreign counter-terrorism operations by Mali's military junta and the unrelenting armed violence in the country led to the withdrawal of French and other European Union troops from Mali. In Mozambique, the regional Southern Africa Development Community, or SADC, and Rwanda supported the Mozambican military in the armed conflict with the insurgency known as Ansar al-Sunnah wa Jamaa, which is associated with the Islamic State. The hostilities in Cabo Delgado province have resulted in unlawful attacks against civilians and the internal displacement of more than 940,000 people over the last 4 years.
For a little bit more on this, we're now joined by Carine Kaneza Nantulya, who's the Advocacy Director in the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you. This report of yours doesn't tell a great story for our continent.
Thanks for having me. Just a quick correction. I'm Deputy Director of the Africa Division.
Thank you very much for that.
Not the Africa Director anymore.
Thank you for that.
Well, our reporting and our documentation over the last year depicts, I would say, a mixed picture of what has been taking place on the continent. On one hand, as you just highlighted, you have serious abuses committed by government and non-governmental forces against civilians. You have crackdown by governments that are increasingly authoritarian on peaceful dissent against activists, journalists, social media influencers. But on the other side, it would be important to point out that there have been some progress related to justice, domestic justice, and mixed international justice processes that have taken place. We would like to highlight, for instance, the special court in Central African Republic, which has indicted 3 rebels. We have in Guinea, for instance, trials that have opened to address and provide justice in the context of the 2009 stadium massacre. The long-awaited trust fund that was mandated by the EU has now started to be operationalized to address the justice needs of the victims of the late Chadian ruler Hissène Habré. So there's some progress, as I just mentioned, but again, we're still waiting to see the establishment of the hybrid court, which is an AU mandated institution to address the cycle of abuses that have taken place in South Sudan since the civil war that started in 2013. So those are some of the highlights that one can also point out.
Is it the same usual suspects that keep on coming on these lists year after year where these abuses are taking place?
Well, one would say that there are, on one hand, you have governments that have been increasingly, for a long time, really closed and are not really allowing access even by international organizations, human rights organizations like ourselves. Eritrea is a good one, is a good example. But you do have countries that represented a few years ago a success story for the African continent that have really taken a turn for the worse. Ethiopia is another example in this case. Let me just quickly, if you don't mind, just point out the fact that when we talk about Ethiopia, because you mentioned the war in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray specifically, we should also, I think, point out that the recent ceasefire agreement that was signed in Pretoria under the auspices of the African Union provides a critical opportunity, an important opportunity for the international community and the African Union specifically to remain vigilant in order to avert the continuation of atrocities and rights abuses. When we look at what has been taking place in the last 2 years, we have to point out again that the ceasefire agreement remains fragile. We still have ongoing displacement by Tigrayans forced out of Western Tigray. Let's remember that there was an ethnic cleansing campaign amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity in Western Tigray by interim authorities, Amara regional forces and militias, and that has obviously created an insurmountable crisis in that region. We still have, again, although the humanitarian access has been allowed in some parts of Tigray, that access has not met cannot meet the needs of the population. You still have a lack of humanitarian assistance in parts that are not under the control of the federal government. You still have Eritrean forces that are still present on the ground. And again, the agreement does not really present a clear picture of what are the accountability mechanisms and tools that will have to be put in place, including, for instance, the inclusion of gender experts and human rights monitors as part of this monitoring mechanism that has been put in place by the African Union.
Yeah, and with conflict, often we see huge numbers of displaced people and people trying to move and seek asylum. They've become vulnerable as well to abuses in that process.
Absolutely. Conflict, climate change, serious adverse weather conditions, and bad governance, corruption have really pushed people into very concerning situations where they actually flee their countries, and at times because of the lack of safe immigration and asylum systems and processes, they meet a very dire fate on the way. Let's remember again some of the very disturbing incidents that we saw recently, where African migrants died on the border between Morocco and Spain, and the other aspect that one also has to point out is the fact that in countries like Eritrea and Cameroon, once these some of their citizens have been forcibly returned, these citizens face serious abuses in the hands of government forces and officials.
Mm. With 54 countries across the continent, we have election cycles happening every year almost. And with that, sadly, we see abuses on opposition parties, illegal detentions, and, just the voices being suppressed. Talk to us a little bit about what you've been able to observe, particularly around politics, democracy, and that kind of thing.
Thank you. Well, we do have at least 9 countries that are going to go through presidential elections this year, right? Including countries like Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Zimbabwe. So the stakes are quite high in a country like, for instance, like Nigeria, where you have a counterinsurgency operations against Boko Haram, and at the same time you have a banditry crisis in the north and western part of the country. You have countries like DRC, where in the eastern part of the country you have the Rwandan-backed rebel group M23 committing atrocities. At the same time, you have a state of emergency declared in Ituri and North Kivu. So it's in terms of security and in terms of the environment in which some of these elections are going to take place. It's going to be a very, very challenging year for the African continent. On the other hand, let's also remember that some of the countries that went into an election last year, like Kenya is a good example. We've seen instances where the elections were somewhat peaceful. Was there dissent? Yes, there was dissent. We've seen the judiciary, which is another important institution, taking the matter in its hand and trying to legislate and adjudicate some of the cases that were brought before the courts. I think it's important to point out that as these elections are taking place, are being prepared, we also see a stronger engagement by civil society organizations. We see an increased level of activism on social media. We saw it during the Kenyan election, for instance, again. We see, and it comes with also its, obviously its downside. We've seen also an increase of hate speech, disinformation on social media. When all is said, I think we have to keep pushing, at least from a human rights perspective, for justice and accountability, for governments to be held accountable every time they violate the rights of their citizens, and also to push for a better promotion and protection of human rights by all the duty bearers and by African human rights institutions, in particular, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the African Court on Human and People's Rights.
Carine, always good to talk to you. I wish we could talk for a bit longer, but this Human Rights Watch World Report is available for free on your website, isn't it?
It is, and
Okay.
please check it out, as well as we also have an introductory essay by our acting executive director, Tirana Hassan, where she talks about, she lays out from a global perspective where we find ourselves in terms of the shifting powers that are at play. So yeah, please go
Great.
ahead and check our report.
Thank you so much. Always good talking to you. Thanks for your time.